The scratching at the vault door stopped 12 hours ago. I should be relieved, but the silence is so much worse. My name is Elias Vance, and this is my 30th day in the dark. The world ended while I was trying to save a piece of it. Day 30. The air runs out in 12 hours. The last of the Bisley water is gone, and the foil wrapper from the final protein bar sits crumpled on the floor, a pathetic silver flag of surrender. But the worst part? The scratching at the vault door has finally stopped. For 22 days, it was a constant, maddening metronome counting down the seconds of my life. Now, there is only silence. And the silence is so much louder than the screams. My name is Elias Vance. I'm an art restorer. Or I was. 30 days ago, I was meticulously cleaning a 17th century Vermeer. Now, I'm cataloging the 57 ways a man can die in a climate-controlled, oxygen-deprived steel box. Suffocation is winning, but starvation is a close second. The choice is simple, I suppose. Die in here, cradled by the priceless art I was meant to protect, or open the 6-inch thick door and face the things that ended the world. The things that have been waiting for me. I think I finally made my decision. This diary, this recording, is not a suicide note. It's a preface. I need to remember how it started. How I, a man who deals in quiet contemplation and the delicate removal of centuries of grime, ended up here, at the very loud and very messy end of everything. It's important to remember, because if I get out of here, I'll be the only one who knows the full story of what happened inside Gallery Sublevel 4. A full zombie survival story written by a man who never even saw one of them. Not yet, anyway. Let's go back to the beginning, to day 1. Day 1. The hum. That's what I remember first. The constant, low-frequency hum of the archival-grade HVAC system. It's the sound of preservation, of perfect temperature and humidity control, the sound of safety. I was working on The Concert by Vermeer, a piece stolen in 1990 and only recently recovered. My hands, steady and sure, were applying a solvent solution with a cotton swab, a process I'd done thousands of times. The smell of turpentine and aged linseed oil was my world. Then, a different sound cut through the hum, a klaxon, loud, insistent, and utterly alien in this subterranean sanctuary. It was followed by a synthesized voice, calm and detached. Containment breach initiated. Level 4 lockdown protocol engaged. This is not a drill. I wasn't scared, annoyed mostly. Probably a chemical spill in one of the other labs. Lockdown meant the massive vault door would seal, and I'd be stuck in here for a few hours. I had my water bottle, a sandwich, and some of the world's greatest art for company.
I made a note in my log, 1432, lockdown initiated, and went back to work. The soft thump and hiss of the vault door sealing was distant, final. I barely noticed it. I had a deadline. The museum's grand reopening was in a month. I had to have the Vermeer ready. I worked for another 3 hours, losing myself in the intricate dance of light and shadow on the canvas. It wasn't until the lights flickered, switching to the harsh, sterile glare of the emergency backup system, that a knot of unease began to form in my stomach. The main power grid for a facility this size doesn't just flicker. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Of course not. I was 3 stories underground. But the museum's internal Wi-Fi was also down. That had never happened before. I walked over to the vault door, a seamless slab of polished steel set into the concrete wall. I pressed the intercom button. Nothing, just dead air. I pressed it again, holding it down. "Hello, this is Elias Vance in the Restoration Vault. Can I get a status update?" Silence was my only reply. I tried the emergency landline on the wall. The receiver was dead, no dial tone. It was then a small, cold seed of genuine fear began to sprout in my chest. This wasn't a chemical spill. This was something else. I spent the next hour trying every communication device, checking every system I had access to from my terminal. Everything was offline, severed. It was as if the vault, and I within it, had been surgically removed from the rest of the world. I told myself to stay calm. Procedure is everything in my line of work. Panic leads to mistakes. I took inventory. 1 turkey sandwich, 1 liter of water, a small bag of almonds. The emergency kit contained 3 foil-wrapped protein bars, 3 liters of Bisley packaged water, a first aid kit, a hand-crank flashlight, and a thermal blanket. Standard, meant to last 72 hours. Plenty of time, I thought. They'll get the system back online soon. They know I'm in here. I made my first entry in this audio diary, mostly to hear another voice, even if it was my own. I described the situation, my initial thoughts, my confidence that this was a temporary system failure. Listening back to it now, I can hear the tremor in my voice, the false bravado of a man trying to convince himself. The first day ended in darkness. I turned off the emergency lights to conserve the battery, plunging the vault into an absolute pitch-black void. The kind of black that feels heavy, that presses in on you. I lay down on the floor, using my jacket as a pillow, the cold concrete seeping into my bones. And for the first time, with the hum of the HVAC now the only sound, I felt truly, utterly alone. I didn't know then that alone was a luxury I was about to lose. Day 2. I woke up stiff, cold, and with a raging thirst. I immediately regretted drinking half my water bottle the day before. Rationing. That was the new reality. I allowed myself 2 sips of water and a quarter of the turkey sandwich. It tasted like sawdust, but it was fuel. I spent the morning in a state of forced productivity. I couldn't work on the Vermeer, not with the main lights out and my hands shaking slightly. Instead, I organized my workspace. I cleaned my tools, arranged my solvents and pigments, and updated my paper logs with meticulous, detailed notes. It was a way to maintain control, to impose order on a situation that was rapidly spiraling into chaos. My world had shrunk to this single, climate-controlled room, approximately 40 by 60 feet. The walls were lined with storage racks holding priceless works of art, all shrouded in protective coverings. In the center was my workstation, an island of scientific precision in a sea of cultural history. I knew every inch of this room, every tool, every chemical. It was my kingdom, and now it was my prison. The emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows, making the shrouded paintings look like silent, looming figures. It was around noon on the second day when I first heard it, a sound from outside. It was faint, muffled by the fixed steel and concrete. A rhythmic banging. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the sound of a rescue team. It was too erratic, too frantic. Then came another sound, a scream, high-pitched, terrified, and abruptly cut short. My blood ran cold. I pressed my ear against the cool steel of the vault door, straining to hear. The air inside the vault was still, the only sound my own ragged breathing and the ever-present hum of the life support. Outside, there was chaos, shouts, more screams, the sound of breaking glass. It sounded like a riot, a violent, citywide riot. My mind raced. A protest that got out of hand? A terrorist attack? I was completely cut off, blind and deaf to the world except for these terrifying, fragmented sounds. The banging on the outer doors of the sublevel continued for hours. It was relentless. I tried to block it out, to focus on my work, but the noise wormed its way into my brain. It was the sound of desperation, or rage. I couldn't tell which was worse. I ate another quarter of my sandwich and drank 2 more sips of water. The food did little to quell the growing anxiety that was gnawing at my insides. I had a small battery-powered tablet in my locker, one I used for referencing digital archives. I'd forgotten about it. With trembling hands, I retrieved it. The battery was at 88%. It couldn't connect to any network, but it had a feature I never used, an emergency broadcast receiver. I activated it. For a long time, there was only static. I cycled through the frequencies, my hope dwindling with each silent channel. Then I caught a fragment, a voice, strained and breathless, crackling through the speaker. Not people. I repeat, they are not. Oh God, they're through the barricade. Get back, fall back to the... The transition ended in a wet, gurgling sound and a burst of static. I sat there, frozen, the tablet in my hand. Not people. What did that mean? The words echoed in the silent vault. The banging outside seemed to take on a new, more sinister quality. It wasn't the sound of fists on metal. It was heavier, more solid, like bodies being thrown against the doors. That night, I didn't turn off the lights. I couldn't bear the thought of being in the dark, alone with those sounds and that fragmented, terrifying message. I huddled in the corner, my thermal blanket wrapped tightly around me, watching the vault door as if I could see through it. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the building, every distant crash sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. This was no riot. This was something else, something unknown and infinitely more horrifying. My 72-hour sanctuary was beginning to feel like a tomb. Day 3, the 72-hour mark, the point at which, under normal circumstances, help would have arrived. The point at which the emergency supplies were designed to run out. No one came. The sounds outside had changed. The frantic banging and shouting had subsided, replaced by a low, constant moaning. It was a guttural, inhuman sound that seemed to come from dozens of throats. It rose and fell in a sickening cadence, a dirge for a world I could no longer see. And there was a new sound, closer this time, a scratching. It was coming from the vault door itself, a light, persistent scraping, like fingernails dragging across steel. The thought made my skin crawl. I had to face the truth. Whatever was happening out there, it wasn't ending anytime soon. No one was coming for me. My survival was now entirely in my own hands. Panic began to set in, a cold, crushing weight on my chest. I fought it down. An art restorer's greatest asset is patience. We can spend a decade on a single painting, working millimeter by millimeter. I had to apply that same discipline to my survival. First, a complete and honest inventory. I laid everything out on the floor. The remains of my sandwich, now stale. The half-empty bag of almonds, the 3 protein bars, the 3 liters of sealed water, and the half-liter from my own bottle. I had a small coffee maker and a tin of coffee grounds, but no way to heat water. A collection of tea bags, a half-eaten chocolate bar. My mind, trained to see detail and composition, arranged them not as a meal, but as a palette of dwindling resources. I calculated my caloric needs, my water intake. If I was careful, brutally careful, I could make the food last 10 days, maybe 12. The water was the real problem. The vault's HVA system recycled the air, but it didn't create water. I had 3.5 liters. At a bare minimum for survival, that was a week, maybe. I had to find another source. The vault had a small chemical-grade sink and a drain, but the water supply had been cut off with everything else. However, the HVA system, it dehumidified the air. The condensation must go somewhere. I spent hours examining the unit, tracing the pipes with my fingers. I found a small maintenance panel near the floor. Behind it was a collection of tubes and a small drip pan for excess condensation, leading to a drain. The pan was damp. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. Using a scalpel from my toolkit, I carefully disconnected the tube leading to the drain and rerouted it into an empty solvent container. I watched for what felt like an eternity. Then I saw it. A single, clear drop of water formed at the end of the tube and fell into the container with a tiny plink. Another followed a few seconds later. It was a painfully slow process, but it was a source. It was life. The water would be distilled, pure, but also devoid of minerals. Not ideal for long-term survival, but infinitely better than nothing. This small victory felt monumental. It was the first time since the lockdown that I felt a flicker of hope. I had taken a piece of my prison and turned it into a tool for survival. I had imposed my will on my environment. The scratching at the door continued, a constant reminder of the horrors outside. But now, I had a purpose beyond just waiting. I had a project, the project of staying alive. I measured out my first day's rations, 2 almonds, a single square of the chocolate bar, and 200 milliliters of water. It was a pathetic meal, but as I consumed it, I felt a grim sense of determination. The world outside might be a post-apocalypse nightmare, but in this room, surrounded by the silent beauty of the past, I would endure. I was a restorer. My job was to preserve things, and now the most important thing I had to preserve was myself. Day 4. The human mind has an astonishing capacity to adapt. The constant low moaning from beyond the vault had become background noise, the new hum of my existence. The scratching at the door was an irritating but familiar part of my daily routine. I had established a strict regiment. Wake up, meditate for 10 minutes to control the anxiety, perform a series of stretches and exercises to keep my muscles from atrophying. Check the water collection system. It was producing nearly a liter a day, a miracle of engineering.
Then, my meager breakfast, consumed slowly, deliberately. The rest of the day was divided into work periods. I couldn't risk working on the actual paintings, but I could maintain my tools. I spent hours sharpening my scalpels, cleaning my brushes, and organizing my pigments by their chemical composition. It was mindless, repetitive work, but it kept my hands busy and my mind focused. It kept me from thinking too much about the scratching. But on the 4th day, a new element was introduced to my sensory prison. A smell. It was faint at first, creeping in through the microscopic air filters of the HVAC system. It was a coppery, metallic scent mixed with something else, a foul, sweet odor of decay. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse. My stomach churned. I knew instinctively what it was. It was the smell of blood, a lot of it, and rot. The air in the vault, once so pure and sterile, now carried the perfume of the end of the world. I tried to mask it. I opened a container of pure gum turpentine. The sharp, pine-like scent helped for a while, but it only layered on top of the pervasive stench from outside. It was like trying to paint a masterpiece over a rotting canvas. The smell was a constant reminder that the abstract sounds I was hearing had a real, physical source. It meant that out there wasn't just chaos, it was death. It was bodies, tiles of them. The thought of what must have happened in the hallways of the museum, the place I had walked every day, was horrifying. The beautiful, sunlit atrium, the quiet galleries, the bustling cafe. I pictured them slick with blood, filled with what? The voice on the radio had said, not people. What were they? The scratching stopped around midday. The sudden silence was jarring. I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear. Had they gone away? Was it over? I crept towards the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I pressed my ear against the cold steel, listening. For a full minute, there was nothing but the hum of the fan and the frantic beating of my own heart. Then a new sound, a wet, tearing noise, followed by a sickening, cracking sound, like a branch being snapped, or a bone. It was a sound of consumption. They weren't gone. They were eating, right outside my door. I stumbled back, a wave of nausea washing over me. I retched, but there was nothing in my stomach to bring up. The reality of my situation crashed down on me with renewed force. I wasn't just hiding from killers. I was hiding from cannibals. The things outside were monsters. The rest of the day passed in a blur of quiet terror. I couldn't work. I couldn't organize. I just sat in the corner, wrapped in my thermal blanket, staring at the door. I watched the single drop of water fall from the tube into my container, over and over again. Plink, plink, plink. Each drop a tiny, insignificant victory against the tide of horror that was waiting for me on the other side of the door. That night, sleep offered no escape. My dreams were filled with the smell of decay and the sound of tearing flesh. I dreamt of the figures in the paintings stepping out of their frames, their faces twisted into masks of hunger, their painted hands reaching for me with sharpened fingernails. I woke up screaming into the silent, sterile darkness of the vault, the smell of death still thick in the air. Day 5. Despair is a patient predator. It circles, it waits, and it strikes when you are at your weakest. I woke up on the 5th day feeling hollowed out, scraped clean by the terror of the previous day. The routine felt pointless. The exercises, the rationing, the meticulous cleaning of my tools, it all seemed like a foolish pantomime of hope in a world that was already dead. I found myself staring at the paintings, a Rembrandt, a Degas, a Monet. They were windows into a world that no longer existed, a world of light, of beauty, of quiet contemplation. Now they were just canvas and pigment, relics of a forgotten age. What was the point of preserving them if there was no one left to see them? What was the point of preserving myself? The thought was seductive in its simplicity. I could open the vault door. It would be over in seconds. No more hunger, no more fear, no more the maddening quiet drip of the water collector. I walked to the door, my hand hovering over the emergency release wheel. It would take all my strength to turn it, but it was possible. My fingers brushed against the cold steel. A single sharp tap echoed from the other side. I froze. It wasn't the mindless scratching or the heavy thuds. It was deliberate. Tap, 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 tap. A pattern. My heart, which had been a leaden weight in my chest, suddenly hammered against my ribs. It was a signal. Someone was out there. Someone intelligent. Hope, fierce and blinding, surged through me. "Hello?" I shouted, my voice cracking from disuse. "Is someone there? Hello?" I pressed my ear to the door, desperate for a reply. Tap, 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 tap. A different pattern. It wasn't a response. It was a continuation. My mind, trained to recognize patterns in brushstrokes and chemical compositions, suddenly understood. It wasn't random. It was a code, Morse code. I fumbled for a piece of charcoal and a sheet of archival paper. I was rusty, my knowledge of Morse code coming from a long-forgotten childhood hobby. I scribbled down the taps as they came, my hand shaking. Tap. No, that wasn't right. I concentrated, filtering out the distant moans and my own frantic breathing. Dot. 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 I translated it slowly, painstakingly. Ye. A cold dread washed over me, extinguishing the flicker of hope. Hungry. Not help us, not are you okay? Hungry. Then a new sound, a voice, distorted and raspy, whispering right through the door seal. We know you're in there. It was a chorus of voices, speaking in a horrifying, discordant unison. Fresh meat. I scrambled backwards, falling over a stool, the charcoal stick clattering to the floor. They weren't survivors. They were the monsters. And they were learning. They were evolving. The mindless scratching had been a test, a way to probe for weaknesses. Now they knew I was here. They knew I was alive. And they were trying to communicate, to terrorize me, to break my will. The tapping continued, more insistent now. S-oh. The rest of the day was a waking nightmare. The whispers would start and stop at random intervals. Sometimes it was a single word. Open,
hissed over and over. Sometimes it was a wet, slobbering sound, a pantomime of drooling hunger. They were intelligent. That was the most terrifying realization of all. These weren't just mindless eating machines. They could think. They could plan. They could taunt. I spent the day barricading the door. It was a futile gesture, I knew. The vault door was designed to withstand a fire for 12 hours. It could certainly withstand them. But I had to do something. I wedged the heavy steel legs of my work table under the release wheel. I piled crates of archival materials against it. I even took down a massive gilt-framed Baroque painting, a depiction of a tranquil pastoral scene, and wedged its heavy oak frame against the door. It felt like a sacrilege, using a masterpiece as a barricade, but my survival was the only art that mattered now. As darkness fell, the tapping stopped, and the whispers faded, replaced once again by the low, constant moaning. But the silence in between was gone. Now, my own mind filled the void with their words. Hungry, sown, fresh meat. I realized then that my prison wasn't just a physical space, it was my own skull, and they had found a way in. Day 6. Fear can be paralyzing, or it can be a catalyst. After a sleepless night, I chose the latter. The terror was still there, a cold, hard knot in my gut, but it was now overlaid with a layer of analytical rage. They thought they could break me? I would study them. I would learn their weaknesses. I was a scientist, a researcher. This vault was my lab, and the creatures outside were my new horrific field of study. I dedicated the entire day to observation. I sat by the vault door, my audio recorder running, logging every sound, every tap, every whisper. I was trying to build a behavioral profile. The moaning was constant, but it peaked in volume and intensity at certain times. Was it random, or was it a response to some external stimulus I couldn't perceive? The tapping and whispering were more sporadic. They seemed to occur when the moaning was at its lowest, as if a kind of collective intelligence could only focus when the baseline chatter of the horde subsided. I noted the pitch and timbre of the whispers. There were at least 5 or 6 distinct voices, if you could call them that. Some were high and raspy, others low and guttural. They all had that same horrifying wet quality. I began to think of them not as a mindless horde, but as a pack of intelligent, coordinated predators. My scientific mind took over, pushing the fear into a separate compartment. What were they? A virus? A mutation? The voice on the emergency broadcast had been cut off before giving any real information. Not people. That was the only clue. What did it mean? Were they biologically transformed humans, or something else entirely? I thought about my own field. I thought about conservation. Sometimes, to save a painting, you have to understand the fungus or mold that is trying to destroy it. You have to study its life cycle, its weaknesses, the environment it needs to thrive. I was the painting. They were the mold. And this vault was the last layer of varnish protecting me. I needed to understand the mold. I started a new log, separate from my personal diary, a specimen log. I gave them designations based on the sounds they made. Whisperer Alpha for the most frequent, raspy voice. Tapper for the one that used Morse code. Guttural for the low, moaning one that seemed to be the background noise. It was a way of objectifying them, of turning my terror into data. Data could be analyzed. Data could be understood. Data was power. My rations for the day, a single protein bar, divided into 3 small pieces, and my carefully measured water, were consumed at my listening post by the door. I didn't want to miss a single sound. In the afternoon, I had a breakthrough. There was a loud crash from far down the corridor, followed by a surge in the volume of the moaning. The creatures were responsive to sound. Loud noises attracted them, agitated them. This was a crucial piece of information. It meant that if I ever got out of here, silence would be my greatest weapon. It also meant that any noise I made inside the vault could potentially attract more of them to my door. I had to be a ghost. The day ended with a new sense of purpose. The fear was still there, but it was no longer a formless, overwhelming dread. It now had a shape, a structure. I had a mission: to know my enemy.
I fell asleep that night, not with dreams of being eaten, but with charts and data points scrolling through my mind. I was no longer just a survivor. I was a researcher, and my research had just begun. Day 7, a full week, 7 days sealed in this metal and concrete box. My body was beginning to feel the effects of the low-calorie diet. I felt a constant, dull ache in my muscles, and my thoughts were becoming sluggish. The initial adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a persistent, weary fatigue. But my resolve to study the creatures remained. Today, I decided to conduct an experiment. Based on my observation that they were attracted to sound, I wanted to test their intelligence further. Could they differentiate between sounds? Could they be baited? My plan was simple. I would use the dead landline phone. I could generate a clicking sound by tapping the hang-up switch. I would tap out a simple, repeating pattern and see if they would mimic it, or if it would just agitate the horde. I set up my audio recorder and began. Click, 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 click. A simple rhythm. I repeated it for a full minute, then stopped and listened. For a moment, there was only the familiar low moaning. My experiment was a failure, I thought. The sound was too quiet, too insignificant to register. Then, the tapping started on the door. It wasn't my rhythm. It was the Morse code again. S, M, A, R, T, F, O, O. My blood ran cold. Smart food. They weren't just mimicking me, they were mocking me. They understood I was testing them. The whisper started, a low, chuckling sound that seemed to vibrate through the very steel of the door. Play with us, little mouse. The experiment had been a success, but in the most horrifying way possible. I had confirmed their intelligence, but I had also confirmed that they were toying with me. I was not the researcher studying the specimen. I was the rat in the maze, and they were the scientists observing my every move, enjoying my fear. The failure was not in the experiment, but in my own arrogance. I had thought I could understand them, categorize them, reduce them to data points on a chart. But they were not simple predators. They were sentient. They were malevolent. And they were enjoying this. A wave of hopelessness washed over me. What was the point of studying them if they were always one step ahead? What chance did I have against a pack of monsters that could learn, adapt, and strategize? I retreated from the door, feeling exposed and foolish. I spent the rest of the day in the furthest corner of the vault, trying to make myself as small as possible. I ate my meager rations in silence, avoiding even the slightest noise. I felt like I was being watched, even though I knew that was impossible. The vault, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a glass cage. The psychological toll of their game was far more damaging than any physical threat they could pose. They were trying to break my mind before they broke down the door. And as I sat there, shivering in the cold, sterile air, I feared they were succeeding. That night, I didn't log their sounds. I didn't update my charts. I just huddled under my blanket and tried not to think. But the chuckling whisper echoed in my mind, a constant, mocking refrain. Little mouse. Day 8. The mind, when starved of stimulus and besieged by fear, begins to create its own reality. The vault was no longer just a room filled with art. It was becoming a gallery of ghosts. The figures in the paintings were starting to feel less like subjects and more like observers. I would catch myself glancing at the shrouded canvases, half expecting to see them move. The portrait of a stern-faced Dutch merchant seemed to be judging my every pathetic action. The laughing peasants in a Bruegel landscape seemed to be mocking my solitude. I knew it was a hallucination, a symptom of sensory deprivation and malnutrition, but the feeling was powerful, undeniable. To combat this, I decided to engage with them, not as ghosts, but as the works of art they were. I needed to reconnect with the man I used to be, the scholar, the restorer. I needed to find solace in the familiar. I chose one painting, a portrait by John Singer Sargent of a young woman in a white dress. I carefully removed its protective covering, and for the first time in over a week, I was face to face with a human being. A painted one, yes, but her eyes held a spark of life, a sense of serene confidence that I desperately needed. I began to talk to her. At first, it was a clinical analysis. I described the brushwork, the use of light, the chemical composition of the pigments. See the way he used lead white mixed with just a touch of viridian to capture the cool light on her dress? I said, my voice hoarse. It's a masterful technique. But as the day wore on, my monologue became more personal. I told her about my life, my studies, my love for the quiet, patient work of restoration. I told her about the world outside, the world that was gone. I told her about the sounds at the door, about the whispers, about my fear. Her painted face remained serene, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the vault walls. But in my starved and fractured mind, her expression seemed to soften. She became my confidant, my silent therapist. Her name was Eleanor, I decided. The real subject's name was lost to history, but she looked like an Eleanor. Talking to Eleanor kept the whispers at bay. It filled the oppressive silence with something other than fear. It was a lifeline to my own sanity, a way to anchor myself in a reality that was rapidly slipping away. I shared my meager dinner with her, placing a single almond on the corner of her massive frame. "Here," I whispered, "you need your strength too." It was a moment of profound madness, and yet it felt completely rational. In a world where the dead walked and whispered through steel doors, having a conversation with a 100-year-old painting seemed perfectly normal. As I prepared for sleep, I carefully recovered the portrait. "Good night, Eleanor," I said. "I'll see you in the morning." For the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace. I was not alone. The vault was filled with silent companions, and they were all on my side. The ghosts in the canvases were no longer a source of fear. They were my army, and together we would face whatever came next. Day 9. My conversations with Eleanor continued. She was a wonderful listener. But my newfound sense of purpose demanded more than just talk. The creatures outside were intelligent. They were a threat. My pathetic barricade of tables and crates was a psychological comfort, nothing more. If they ever found a way to breach the vault's locking mechanism, I would be defenseless. I needed a weapon. My toolkit was designed for creation and preservation, not destruction. Scalpels, brushes, palette knives, they were too small, too delicate. I needed something with reach and heft. My eyes scanned the vault, reassessing every object, not for its artistic or practical value, but for its potential as an instrument of violence. My gaze fell upon a collection of empty, heavy oak frames stored in a corner. They were from the Baroque period, thick and ornate, designed to hold massive canvases. One in particular caught my eye. It was a long, rectangular frame, about 7 feet in length. The wood was dense, ancient, and incredibly strong. But it was the corner pieces that gave me the idea. They were joined with heavy hand-forged iron braces, sharp and angular. I spent the entire day working on it. It was hard, physical labor, something my body desperately needed. Using a hammer and a small pry bar, I carefully, painstakingly began to dismantle the frame. The wood groaned in protest, the sound echoing loudly in the vault. I froze after every loud crack, listening for a reaction from outside. The moaning intensified,
But the whispers and tapping remained silent. They were listening, I knew. They were curious. After hours of sweat and effort, I managed to pry one of the long 7-foot sections of oak free. It was heavy, nearly 30 pounds, and felt solid and powerful in my hands. It was a start, a decent club, but I could do better. I needed a point. My eyes landed on my collection of restoration tools. I had a set of large, industrial-grade palette knives used for mixing large quantities of plaster for repairing frames. One was nearly a foot long, made of high-carbon steel with a thick, triangular blade. It was essentially a short spearhead. The next challenge was attaching it to the oak beam. I had no nails, no screws, but I did have something else. In a temperature-controlled cabinet was a collection of conservation-grade adhesives. One of them was a 2-part epoxy resin designed for bonding stone and metal. Its tensile strength was rated at over 5,000 psi. Once it cured, it would be stronger than the wood itself. I carefully prepared the resin, mixing the 2 viscous liquids on a glass plate. The chemical smell filled the air, a sharp, clean scent that cut through the ever-present stench of decay from outside. I meticulously applied the epoxy to the base of the palette knife and the end of the oak beam, lashing them together tightly with strips of archival linen tape to hold them in place while the resin cured. I had created a spear, a 7-foot-long, 30-pound spear, tipped with a foot of sharpened steel. It was a crude, ugly thing, a perversion of the beautiful objects I was trained to create. But as I leaned it against the wall to cure, I felt a surge of primal satisfaction. It was a weapon. It was my weapon. I had taken the elements of my old life, the frame that held the art, the tool that restored it, the chemical that preserved it, and forged them into an instrument of survival. I looked from my new spear to the portrait of Eleanor. Her serene expression seemed to approve. The art in the vault was no longer just a source of comfort. It was now my arsenal. And I was no longer just a restorer. I was a warrior. Day 10. A third of the way through my self-imposed 30-day deadline. My spear, which I had named the Conservator, stood curing in the corner, a silent sentinel. Its presence changed the atmosphere of the vault. It was a physical manifestation of my will to fight back, and it gave me a renewed sense of confidence. With the weapon problem provisionally solved, I returned my focus to my primary research, understanding the enemy. I had been logging their sounds, but I needed more data. I needed to understand their patterns over a longer period. I spent the entire day listening, not just with my ears, but with my whole body. I would lie on the floor, my cheek pressed against the cold concrete, feeling the vibrations that traveled through the building's foundation. I discovered that the horde was not a constant presence. It was tidal. There was a rhythm to their movements. In what I guessed was the early morning, the sounds were at their lowest. The moaning was sparse, the activity outside my door minimal. It was a period of relative dormancy. As the day progressed, the activity would build, reaching a frantic peak in the late afternoon. This was when the banging, the screaming, from new victims I presumed, and the general chaos were at their worst. Then, as evening fell, a strange thing would happen. The frantic energy would dissipate, replaced by a more focused, organized behavior. This was the time of the whispers, the tapping, the psychological warfare. This was when the pack would hunt, not for food, but for entry points, for weaknesses, for me. This discovery was a game changer. It meant there were periods of relative safety, times when I could risk making noise, like when I was building my spear. It also meant there were periods of extreme danger, when I had to be absolutely silent and still. I began to structure my day around their rhythm. I would sleep during the morning lull, conserving my energy. My work, exercising, maintaining my tools, working on my water collector, would be done during the chaotic afternoon peak, when any noise I made would be masked by the general din. And the nights were for vigilance. I would sit in the darkness, my back against the wall, the Conservator resting in my lap,
And I would listen. I would listen to them testing my fortress, whispering their empty threats. I felt like a medieval scholar in a besieged monastery, listening to the barbarians at the gate. The world outside was governed by this new, horrifying circadian rhythm. The rising and setting of the sun had been replaced by the ebb and flow of the dead. I was adapting to it, syncing my own survival to their schedule. It was a strange, intimate dance with my would-be killers. That night, as I sat at my listening post, a new whisper started. It was different from the others. It was a single voice, clearer and less raspy. And it wasn't threatening. It was singing. A children's nursery rhyme. Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies. The voice was high, like a young girl's. It was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. It was a sound of innocence twisted into a weapon of pure psychological horror. The song went on, over and over, a broken record of a dead childhood. I squeezed the shaft of my spear, the rough oak biting into my palm. The fight for my survival wasn't just about food, water, and weapons. It was a war for my own mind. And the enemy was becoming more creative. Day 11. The little girl's song haunted my sleep. It was a more effective weapon than any physical assault. It chipped away at my sanity, piece by piece. I woke up with a new resolve. I couldn't just sit here and listen to their psychological games. I needed to be proactive. I needed to create a better defense. My barricade was useless.
The vault door was strong, but what if it wasn't the door they were targeting? What if they found another way in? A ventilation shaft? A structural weakness? I had to assume the door was my only line of defense, and I had to make it as unappealing as possible. My mind turned to my chemical cabinet. As a restorer, I worked with a vast array of volatile and often dangerous substances: solvents, acids, bases, bonding agents. I had always treated them with the utmost respect and caution. Now I looked at them with a new, weaponized perspective. I couldn't create an explosive. I didn't have the knowledge or the materials. But I could create a deterrent, a chemical barrier. My plan was to create a cocktail of the most noxious, irritating substances I had and find a way to apply it to the exterior of the vault door. The problem was delivery. I couldn't open the door, obviously. But there was a small circular port in the center of the door, about the size of a fist. It was a high-pressure release valve designed to vent gases in case of a chemical fire inside the vault. It was sealed from the inside with a simple hand wheel. I had never had a reason to open it. Now I had one. I spent the morning preparing my concoction. I wore my respirator and safety goggles. I mixed acetone, ammonia, and several powerful industrial solvents into a large beaker. The fumes were overwhelming, even with the respirator. It was a foul, acrid mixture that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. It was perfect. The next step was the most dangerous. I had to open the valve. I had no idea what was on the other side. Was one of them waiting right there? I approached the door, my spear in one hand, the beaker of chemicals in the other. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I took a deep breath and began to turn the wheel. It was stiff from disuse. It groaned in protest. Outside, the moaning immediately intensified. They heard the sound. I turned the wheel faster, putting all my weight into it. With a final loud clink, the valve opened. I peered through the small, thick glass porthole next to the valve. All I could see was darkness and a writhing mass of shapes. I didn't wait to get a better look. I poured the chemical cocktail through the valve's opening. It splashed onto whatever was outside. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. A chorus of shrieks erupted, not human, but animalistic and filled with pain. It was a sound of sizzling, as if my chemical brew was corrosive. The moaning turned into enraged roars. Heavy, powerful thuds began to slam against the door, making the entire steel slab vibrate.
I quickly sealed the valve, my hand shaking so badly I could barely turn the wheel. I had made them angry, very angry, but I had also hurt them. I had proven that they were not invincible. They could be harmed. The furious assault on the door continued for nearly an hour before subsiding, replaced by the familiar moaning, which now seemed to have a wounded, resentful quality. I leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, the beaker still in my hand. I had fought back. I had drawn first blood. It was a small victory, a temporary reprieve, but it was a victory nonetheless. I had used the tools of my trade, the knowledge of my craft, to inflict pain on the monsters outside. The chemist in me had overcome the victim. And for the first time, I felt something other than fear. I felt a cold, hard flicker of rage. Day 12. The aftermath of my chemical attack was a day of relative quiet. The whispers and tapping ceased completely. The moaning from outside the door was more subdued, and the scratching was gone. My concoction had worked better than I'd hoped. It had created a dead zone right outside my door. They were avoiding the area. This newfound peace was unsettling. It felt like the calm before a storm. I knew they were still out there, thinking, planning their retaliation. But for now, I had a reprieve, and I decided to use it to gather more intelligence. The porthole. The small, thick glass window next to the pressure valve. I had only glanced through it during my chemical attack. Now I was going to use it to finally see my enemy. I needed to know what I was fighting. I spent a long time preparing myself mentally. What would I see? The voice on the radio had said, "Not people." My imagination had run wild with possibilities. I feared that seeing them would break the last vestiges of my sanity. But not knowing was worse. I had to see. I took my hand crank flashlight and approached the door. I placed my eye to the cool, thick glass of the porthole. It was dark on the other side. The hallway's lights were out. I held the flashlight up to the glass, shielding my eyes from the reflection, and cranked the handle. A beam of light cut through the darkness outside. My breath caught in my throat. The hallway was a war zone. The pristine white walls were sprayed with blood and viscera. Debris was everywhere. And then I saw them. They were clustered further down the hall, just at the edge of my flashlight's beam, as if wary of the chemical stench near the door. Not people was an understatement. They had been human once, I could see that. They wore the tattered remains of clothes, museum uniforms, visitor attire. But they were horribly, grotesquely transformed. Their skin was a mottled gray, stretched taut over their emaciated frames. Their limbs were elongated, their joints bent at unnatural angles. But it was their faces that would be seared into my memory forever. Their jaws were unhinged, filled with broken, sharpened teeth. Their eyes were gone, replaced by milky white orbs that seemed to glow faintly in the flashlight's beam. They were blind. That explained their reliance on sound. They were sniffing the air, their heads twitching back and forth like carrying birds sensing death. One of them turned its head in my direction, its blank eyes seeming to stare right at me. Its mouth opened, and a low, guttural moan escaped its throat. It was the sound I had been hearing for 12 days. Seeing them, putting a face to the horror, was both terrifying and, in a strange way, clarifying. They were not supernatural demons. They were biological abominations. They were sick, twisted, but they were physical. They could be fought. They could be killed. I watched them for nearly an hour, my arm aching from cranking the flashlight. I studied their movements, their interactions. They moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, but with a terrifying speed when agitated. They seemed to communicate with a series of clicks and groans, a rudimentary language of the damned. I saw one of them gnawing on a bone that was unmistakably human. The sight sent a fresh wave of nausea through me, but I forced myself to keep watching, to keep recording the data. I was no longer fighting ghosts in the dark. I now knew my enemy's face, and it was a face I would see in my nightmares for the rest of my life, however long that might be. I finally stepped away from the porthole, my mind reeling. The abstract threat had become horrifyingly concrete. But with that clarity came a new, grim determination. I knew what I was up against, and I knew that staying in this vault was no longer a viable long-term option. Sooner or later, they would find a way in, or I would run out of supplies. My survival now depended on one thing: finding a way out. Day 13. Seeing the creatures, the blanks, as I started calling them in my log because of their empty eyes, had changed my entire mindset. The vault was no longer a fortress, it was a temporary shelter. Survival was no longer about outlasting the siege, it was about planning the escape. My mind, which for days had been focused inward on the tiny details of my prison, now expanded outward. I needed a map, not of the world, but of the museum. My workstation had a terminal that, while cut off from the outside network, still contained a vast internal archive of the museum's data. Schematics, floor plans, security layouts. I had used them a dozen times to coordinate the transport of large artworks. Now, I would use them to plan my own exodus. I powered up the terminal, the familiar glow of the screen a welcome sight. I pulled up the architectural blueprints of the museum. 3 sublevels of collections and labs, a main ground floor with the atrium and public galleries, and 2 upper floors of offices and archives. I was in the deepest, most secure part of the building. Getting out would be a Herculean task. I spent the entire day studying the plans, my mind racing, analyzing every corridor, every stairwell, every potential choke point and hiding place. I was no longer an art restorer, I was a military strategist. The blanks were blind, but their hearing was acute. This meant that long, open corridors were death traps. I needed a route with lots of cover, lots of smaller rooms to duck into. The main stairwells were out of the question. The sound would echo, drawing every blank in the vicinity. The elevators were obviously offline. That left the service corridors and maintenance shafts. They were tight, cramped, and rarely used. Perfect. My target was the roof. The museum had a rooftop garden and access to the main HVAC units. If I could get to the roof, I would have a vantage point. I could see the state of the city, assess the scale of the infestation. And from there, maybe, just maybe, I could find a way across to an adjacent building. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was better than sitting here and waiting to die. I traced a potential route with my finger on the screen. From my vault, down a service corridor to maintenance shaft C. Up 3 flights of emergency ladders to the ground floor. Across a section of the main gallery, this would be the most dangerous part, to the employee wing. Then up the back stairwell to the roof access door. It was a journey of maybe 1,000 feet, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles. Each section presented its own unique set of challenges and dangers. I began to make a list of supplies I would need. A go bag. I had a sturdy leather satchel I used to carry my tools. It would have to do. In it, I would pack my remaining protein DARs, my water container, the hand crank flashlight, and a small first aid kit. My weapon, the conservator, would be in my hands. I also needed other tools, a pry bar, a wire cutter. I packed them from my toolkit. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since the lockdown began. I had a plan. I had a mission. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but now it was focused. It was the fear of a soldier before a battle, not the helpless terror of a victim. I looked at the blueprint on the screen, my path of escape glowing in the dim light of the vault. It was a map to a new world. A world of monsters and ruins, yes, but also a world of possibility. A world where I could fight back. A world where I could be free. The plan was to leave on day 30. That gave me 17 more days to prepare, to train, to gather my strength. 17 days to turn myself from a scholar into a survivor. Day 14.
A plan without preparation is just a wish. My escape route was ambitious, bordering on suicidal. If I was going to attempt it, I needed to be in the best possible physical and mental condition. My body, weakened by 2 weeks of near starvation, was my first priority. I ramped up my exercise regimen. The gentle stretches were replaced by grueling workouts. I used the heavy art crates as weights, lifting them until my muscles screamed in protest. I did push-ups, sit-ups, and burpees until I collapsed on the floor, gasping for air in the recycled atmosphere. I ran laps around the perimeter of the vault, my footsteps a soft, rhythmic patter on the concrete. I had to build my stamina. The journey to the roof would be a vertical climb and a mad dash. I couldn't afford to run out of energy halfway through. I also adjusted my diet. I was still rationing, but I changed the schedule. I would eat a larger portion of my protein bar before my workouts, giving my body the fuel it needed. The hunger was a constant, gnawing presence, but I learned to embrace it. It was a reminder of what I was fighting for. But physical conditioning was only half the battle. I needed to prepare my mind for the horrors I would face. I had to desensitize myself. I began to spend hours at the porthole, watching the blanks. I forced myself to look at them, to study their grotesque forms, to memorize their jerky, unnatural movements. I watched them feed. I watched them fight amongst themselves, tearing each other apart over scraps of flesh. At first, the sight made me sick. But day by day, I grew colder, more detached. I was no longer looking at former human beings. I was looking at obstacles, targets. I also practiced with my weapon. The conservator was heavy and unwieldy. I needed it to be an extension of my own body. I spent hours practicing thrusts, parries, and sweeps in the confined space of the vault. I set up a target, a stack of archival foam, and practiced hitting it from different angles with speed and precision. I imagined the foam was a blank, its head, its chest. I learned the balance of the spear, the way its weight shifted as I moved. I developed a fighting style born of desperation and necessity. It was clumsy, brutish, but it was mine. In the evenings, I would sit with Eleanor's portrait and talk. But my conversations were different now. I no longer spoke of fear and despair. I spoke of my plan, of my training, of my determination. I was hardening myself, forging my fear into a weapon as potent as my spear. I was stripping away the scholar, the artist, the gentle man I used to be, and replacing him with something new.
Something harder, something capable of surviving the world outside. The transformation was painful. There were moments when I would catch my reflection in a dark screen and not recognize the man staring back. His eyes were colder, his jaw set in a permanent clench. He looked like a predator, and in the new world, that was exactly what I needed to be. Day 15, halfway point. My body was sore, my mind was sharp, and my resolve was absolute. My daily routine was now a well-oiled machine of survival. Wake, exercise, eat, observe, train, plan, sleep, repeat. But as I honed my body and my strategy, I realized I was neglecting one of my greatest assets, my mind's library. I had spent my entire life accumulating knowledge, not just about art, but about history, science, and literature. In a world without internet, without books, the knowledge stored in my own head was a precious resource. I decided to dedicate part of each day to mental exercises. I would lie in the dark and reconstruct famous paintings from memory, brushstroke by brushstroke. It was a way to keep my visualization skills sharp, to maintain my connection to the world of beauty and order. But I also delved into more practical memories. I recalled documentaries I had watched about survival, about engineering, about human anatomy. I tried to remember the weak points of the human body, the temples, the neck, the joints. The blanks were no longer human, but their basic structure was the same. Where would a spear thrust be most effective? I reconstructed historical battles in my mind. The Battle of Thermopylae, a small, disciplined force holding off a massive horde in a narrow pass. My escape route through the service corridors was my own thermopylae. I needed to think tactically, to use the environment to my advantage. I even found a use for my knowledge of chemistry beyond making noxious cocktails. I thought about the properties of the substances I had. Acetone was a powerful solvent. Could it be used to weaken plastic locks or window seals? Turpentine was flammable. Could I create a makeshift torch or a diversion? I began to see my collection of art supplies not just as tools, but as a chest of scientific puzzles, each with a potential application for my survival. This mental work was just as important as the physical training. It kept my mind active and engaged, preventing it from succumbing to the despair and madness that were always lurking at the edges of my consciousness. It also gave me a sense of control. The blanks had superior numbers and strength, but I had knowledge. I had the accumulated wisdom of human civilization stored in my brain, and I would use that knowledge to outwit them. One evening, as I was mentally cataloging the flammable solvents in my cabinet, I heard a new sound from outside. It was a rhythmic, metallic scraping. It was slow, deliberate, and powerful. It was not the sound of fingernails. It was the sound of something hard, something metal, being dragged against the steel of the vault door. They were learning. They were adapting. They were using tools. My blood ran cold. The game had changed once again. My intellectual advantage was being challenged. The race to day 30 had just become a lot more urgent. Day 16. The metallic scraping was relentless. It went on for hours, a grating, nerve-shredding sound that set my teeth on edge. They had found a tool. A piece of rebar, a pipe, I didn't know. But they were using it to systematically attack the door. I watched through the porthole, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. A group of 5 blanks were working together. One, a massive creature that might have been a museum security guard, was holding a long, thick pipe. It was methodically scraping it back and forth across the door's main locking mechanism, located near the emergency wheel. Sparks flew with each grating pass. The other 4 blanks stood around it, moaning in a low, rhythmic chorus, as if encouraging the worker. It was a display of coordinated, tool-based problem-solving. It was terrifying. My chemical deterrent had kept them at bay, but it hadn't defeated them. It had only forced them to evolve their tactics. They were no longer trying to brute force their way in. They were targeting a specific weak point. I knew the vault door specifications. It was hardened steel, resistant to cutting torches and explosives. A pipe, no matter how strong, wouldn't be able to cut through it. But it could, over time, damage the external locking mechanism. It could wear it down, weaken it, until it failed. They were trying to grind their way in. The siege had begun in earnest. My 30-day timeline was no longer a choice. It was a deadline imposed by the enemy. I had to assume that they would eventually succeed. The question was whether my preparations would be complete before they did. The scraping sound became the new soundtrack to my life. It was a constant, grinding reminder of the forces working against me. It made it difficult to think, to concentrate. I had to force myself to stick to my routine, to block out the noise and focus on my training. My workouts became more frantic, fueled by a new, desperate energy. My spear practice became more violent. I was no longer just training. I was preparing for an imminent battle. I had to find a way to counter their new tactic. I couldn't use my chemical attack again. They were too smart to fall for the same trick twice. I needed a new weapon, a new strategy. I looked around the vault, my eyes scanning for anything I could use. My gaze fell upon the fire suppression system. The vault was equipped with a halon gas system, designed to extinguish a fire without damaging the artwork. It worked by displacing oxygen. If I could somehow vent the halon gas outside the door, it was a crazy idea. Halon gas was non-toxic, but in a high enough concentration, it would suffocate any air-breathing creature. Did the blanks breathe? I assumed they did. Their moans and whispers had to come from some kind of respiratory system. But activating the system would flood the vault as well. It was a suicide mission. Unless I had my own supply of air. I looked at the small portable oxygen tank that was part of the emergency fire kit. It was designed to provide about 15 minutes of breathable air for a firefighter. 15 minutes? Was it enough time to vent the gas, wait for it to affect the blanks, and then for the vault's HVAC system to clear the air? It was an incredibly risky gamble, but it was the only card I had left to play. The plan was desperate, but it was a plan. I would hold it in reserve, a last resort. For now, all I could do was listen to the relentless scraping and pray that the steel of the door would hold longer than the steel of my own resolve. Day 17. The constant, grinding noise was more than just a physical assault. It was a weapon of psychological warfare. It was impossible to sleep for more than a few minutes at a time. The sound vibrated through the floor, through my bones, into the very core of my being. My carefully constructed mental fortitude was beginning to crack. I found myself becoming irritable, angry. I would yell at the silent paintings, curse at the scraping door. My conversations with Eleanor became frantic, one-sided rants. She was no longer a calming presence. She was a witness to my descent. My hands started shaking again, a fine tremor that I couldn't control. It made my detailed work impossible. I tried to sharpen a scalpel and ended up slicing my finger open. The sight of my own blood, bright red against the sterile white of my workspace, sent a jolt of primal fear through me. I was suddenly acutely aware of my own vulnerability. I was just a soft, fragile bag of flesh and blood. And outside, the creatures of tooth and nail were trying to get to it. I patched up my finger, my movements clumsy and rushed. The small injury felt like a major defeat. It was a sign that I was losing control. The physical and mental exhaustion was taking its toll. I was making mistakes. And in this new world, a single mistake could be fatal. I had to do something to regain my focus. I turned to the one thing that had always calmed me, the one thing that required absolute precision and concentration, my work. I decided to risk it. I needed to restore something, not just for the sake of the art, but for the sake of my own sanity. I chose a small, damaged panel painting from the 15th century. It had a long, thin crack running through the gesso and paint layers. My task was to carefully fill the crack, to in-paint the loss, to make the damage disappear. It was a delicate, microscopic process. As I sat down at my workstation, the familiar tools in my hand, the scraping sound at the door seemed to fade into the background. My world shrank to the tip of my brush, to the tiny, millimeter-wide canyon of the crack. I mixed my pigments, my hand slowly steadying as I focused on the task. I applied the first layer of fill, my breathing becoming slow and regular. For a few hours, I was no longer a prisoner. I was no longer a terrified survivor. I was Elias Vance, art restorer. I was doing what I was born to do. I was healing something that was broken. The work was a meditation. It was a rebellion. It was a declaration that even in the face of Armageddon, beauty and order still had meaning. I did not finish the restoration, but I had started it, and in doing so, I had restored a small piece of myself. I had found a way to fight back against the psychological erosion. The scraping continued. The threat was still there, but as I cleaned my brushes that evening, I felt a renewed sense of calm. They could assault my fortress, they could torment my ears, but they could not touch my soul. My soul lived in the tip of my brush, in the patient, quiet act of making something whole again. Day 18. The scraping stopped. The sudden, profound silence was more alarming than the noise itself. I rushed to the porthole, my heart pounding. The big blank with the pipe was gone. The others were still there, milling about at the edge of the hallway, but they were no longer focused on the door. Had they given up? Was it possible? I watched them for a long time, trying to understand their change in behavior. They seemed agitated. They were clicking and moaning to each other, their movements more jerky and erratic than usual. It was as if they were arguing or confused. Then the whisper started again. But this time they were different. It wasn't the taunting, malevolent chorus from before. It was a single voice, the voice of the little girl. But she wasn't singing. She was crying. A pathetic, heart-wrenching sob that seemed to echo in the hallway. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated misery. It was a trap. I knew it was a trap. They were trying a new tactic. They had tried intimidation, brute force, and psychological horror. Now they were trying pity. They were trying to appeal to the last vestiges of my humanity. "Help me," the little girl's voice whispered, broken by sobs. "It's so dark." I stood there, my hand on the cold steel of the door, my resolve wavering. I knew it was a lie. I knew it was one of them, a creature of nightmare, mimicking the sounds of a lost child. But the sound was so convincing. What if? What if there was a survivor out there? A child who had somehow managed to live through this hell? Could I condemn her to death just to save myself? The thought was agonizing. It was a direct assault on my conscience, on the moral code of the man I used to be. The man who helped people, who valued life above all else. "Please," the voice whimpered, "I'm scared." I stood there, my hand on the cold steel of the door, my resolve wavering. I knew it was a lie. I knew it was one of them, a creature of nightmare, mimicking the sounds of a lost child. But the sound was so convincing. What if? What if there was a survivor out there? A child who had somehow managed to live through this hell? Could I condemn her to death just to save myself? The thought was agonizing. It was a direct assault on my conscience, on the moral code of the man I used to be. The man who helped people, who valued life above all else. "Please," the voice whimpered, "I'm scared." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. I pictured the blanks I had seen through the porthole, their empty eyes, their unhinged jaws. That was the reality, not this phantom child. This was their most brilliant, most cruelest trick yet. They had found my ultimate weakness, my own compassion. I had to fight it. I had to kill that part of myself. I put on my industrial earmuffs, the ones I used when working with loud machinery. They muffled the sound, reducing the heartbreaking sobs to a distant, tinny whine. It was enough. It allowed me to regain control, to think rationally. I would not open the door. I would not fall for their trap. But the cost of that decision was high. I had to actively choose to ignore the pleas of a suffering child, real or not. And in doing so, I felt another piece of my old self die. I was becoming harder, colder, more pragmatic. I was becoming the kind of person who could survive in this new world. But I wasn't sure if I would like the man I was becoming. The crying continued for the rest of the day, a constant, miserable backdrop to my existence. Even with the earmuffs, I could feel the vibrations of it. It was a sound that would stay with me forever, a ghost in my memory. The price of survival, I was learning, was paid in pieces of your own soul. Day 19. The crying of the ghost child finally stopped in the early hours of the morning. The silence that followed was heavy with an unspoken threat. Their attempt at emotional manipulation had failed. I knew what would come next: rage, retaliation. I had to be ready. I spent the day preparing for their next assault, whatever form it might take. I reinforced my pathetic barricade, checked the seal on the pressure valve, and practiced with my spear until my arms ached. But I knew it wasn't enough. I needed a new advantage. I needed something that would not just deter them, but terrify them. I needed fire. My mind went back to the flammable solvents in my cabinet.
turpentine, denatured alcohol, mineral spirits.
I had a significant quantity of each. I also had archival linen tape, glass beakers, and cotton swabs, the components of a Molotov cocktail. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. I had never handled fire in such a weaponized way. The risk of setting the entire vault with its priceless flammable contents ablaze was enormous, but the risk of not doing it was even greater. I began my work with the meticulous care of a chemist. I chose a dozen thick glass beakers. I filled each one halfway with a mixture of turpentine and denatured alcohol. For a wick, I used the linen tape, stuffing a long strip into each beaker, leaving a tail hanging out. I had created a small arsenal of incendiary devices, but how to light them? I had no matches, no lighter. The vault was a strictly no-flame zone. I searched every drawer, every cabinet, every emergency kit. Nothing. My plan had a fatal flaw. I sat at my workstation, defeated, staring at my row of useless firebombs. Then my eyes fell on the hand-crank flashlight. I had taken it apart a few days ago to see how it worked. A simple dynamo, converting mechanical energy into electricity to power a small LED bulb. Electricity. Where there is electricity, there is the potential for a spark. I disassembled the flashlight again. I stripped the wires leading to the bulb. I took a small piece of cotton, teased from a swab, and fluffed it up until it was a wispy, highly flammable ball. I held the two bare wires on either side of the cotton. I began to crank the handle, slowly at first, then faster and faster. A tiny blue spark jumped between the wires. The cotton ball instantly ignited, flaring up in a brief, brilliant flash of light before turning to ash. I let out a triumphant shout. I had done it. I had created fire. It was a Promethean moment. In the depths of my concrete prison, surrounded by darkness and decay, I had harnessed the primal element of creation and destruction. I now had a way to light my weapons. My plan was to use them in conjunction with the pressure valve. I could light a Molotov, push it through the valve, and let it smash on the floor of the hallway outside. It would create a wall of fire, a barrier that even the Blinks, in their mindless rage, would have to respect. I lined up my new weapons on a shelf, a row of glass promises of fiery retribution. The balance of power had shifted once again. I was no longer just a defender. I was an aggressor. Let them come. I was ready to give them a taste of hell. Day 20. The attack came at dusk. It was not subtle. It was not clever. It was pure, unrestrained fury. A massive, deafening boom shook the entire vault, knocking me off my feet. It was not a sound I had heard before. It was the sound of a battering ram. I scrambled to the porthole. A group of 10 blanks were holding a huge, steel display pedestal, the kind that used to hold a rodent sculpture. They were using it as a battering ram, swinging it in a coordinated rhythm and slamming it into the vault door. 1, 2, 3, heave! A chorus of guttural roars seemed to say. Each impact was like a thunderclap. The steel door, my invincible fortress, groaned and shuddered. A fine shower of dust fell from the ceiling. They were going to break it down. Not grind it, not pick it, but smash it open with sheer brute force. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. This was it, the end game. My carefully laid plans, my 30-day timeline, it was all meaningless now. They were coming in, now. I grabbed my spear, my hands slick with sweat. My mind was a whirlwind of terror. Then I saw them. My row of Molotov cocktails waiting patiently on the shelf. The sight of them cleared my head, replaced the panic with a cold, focused rage. "You want in?" I snarled at the door. "Come on then." I worked quickly, my movements sure and steady. I grabbed my flashlight sparker and a beaker of fuel. I rushed to the pressure valve, the conservator clutched in my other hand. I spun the wheel, opening the port. The roaring of the horde and the crashing of the ram became deafening. I held the wires to the wick of the Molotov, I cranked the handle. The wick caught fire, a bright, hungry flame. Without a second's hesitation, I shoved the flaming beaker through the port. I heard it smash on the floor outside, followed by a whoosh as the fuel ignited. A wave of heat washed through the open port. I peered through the glass. The hallway outside was an inferno. A wall of fire 10 feet high raged where the battering ram team had been standing. The air was filled with the most horrifying sound I had ever heard. The shrieks of the blanks as they burned alive. Their bodies, coated in the flammable gel of my chemical attack from days before, went up like torches. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, a sickening sweet stench that choked me. The assault on the door stopped instantly. The rest of the horde, those who were not caught in the fire, fell back, moaning in what sounded like terror. They were afraid of fire. It was their primal weakness. I shoved another lit Molotov through the port for good measure, spreading the fire further down the hall. I then sealed the valve, my heart hammering in my chest, my body trembling with adrenaline. I had done it. I had stopped them. I had turned their own fury against them. I leaned against the door, the steel hot against my back, and listened to the screams of my enemies as they burned. I should have felt sick. I should have been horrified by what I had done, but I wasn't. I felt a grim, savage satisfaction. I felt powerful. The man who had flinched at the sight of his own blood was gone. In his place was a monster, born of fire and desperation, a monster capable of fighting the other monsters. And as the screams outside finally faded into silence, I knew that I had won the battle. But the war for my soul was far from over. Day 21. The world outside my door was silent. Not the tense, listening silence of before, but a dead, empty silence. The fire had burned for hours, the orange glow visible through the porthole. Now there was only darkness. The smell of burnt meat and chemicals lingered in the air, a foul reminder of the previous night's battle. I spent the day in a state of shock, the adrenaline slowly seeping out of my system, leaving me exhausted and hollow. I was a victor, but my victory felt tainted, ugly. The memory of the burning blanks, their shrieking, writhing forms, was seared into my mind. I had unleashed a horror to defeat a horror, and the act had changed me. I tried to work on the panel painting, to find solace in the quiet act of restoration, but my hands trembled too much. The delicate brushstrokes were beyond me. The man who had wielded fire and death could no longer command the gentle tools of creation. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of a display case. My face was gaunt, my eyes wide and haunted. There was a smudge of soot on my cheek, like a tribal marking. I looked like a savage. I had survived, but what was the cost? The silence from the horde was complete. Had I killed them all? The ones near my door, at least. Or had I just scared them away, driven them to another part of the museum? I didn't know. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The thought of leaving the vault, my sanctuary, now seemed more terrifying than ever. Out there was a world I had proven I could survive in, but only by becoming something I despised. In here, in the quiet, sterile dark, I was still Elias Vance, the scholar. Out there, I was the firebringer, the monster killer. The rest of the day passed in a quiet, introspective haze. I cleaned my weapons, restocked my small arsenal of Molotovs, and went through the motions of my survival routine. But my heart wasn't in it. The fire had burned away my fear, but it seemed to have taken my hope with it. What was I fighting for? To escape this vault and enter a world of ashes and death? To become a full-time killer, a scavenger, a ghost haunting the ruins of civilization? The silence outside was a mirror of the silence inside me, a vast, empty space where my humanity used to be. As night fell, I didn't sit at my listening post. I didn't train. I simply lay on the floor, wrapped in my blanket,
and stared up at the dark ceiling. The battle had been won. But I felt, with a chilling certainty, that I was losing the war. Day 22. I was woken from a restless sleep by a new sound. It was a soft, rhythmic drumming, a gentle patter that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It took me a moment to identify it. It was the sound of rain. I rushed to the main terminal and pulled up the museum's internal sensor network. Most of it was offline, but a few atmospheric sensors on the roof were still drawing power from a solar backup. They confirmed it. Barometric pressure dropping, humidity at 100%, precipitation detected. It was raining. The sound, so normal, so mundane, was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. It was a sound from the old world, a sound of life, of cleansing, of renewal. It was a message from a planet that was still turning, a world that was still alive, despite the plague that infested it. I stood in the middle of the vault and just listened. The sound was faint, filtered through 3 stories of concrete and steel, but it was there. It was a connection to the outside, not of terror, but of peace. The rain seemed to wash away some of the grime that had accumulated on my soul. It reminded me that there was still a world worth fighting for. A world of simple things, like the smell of wet earth and the sound of rain on a roof. My despair from the previous day began to recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. The fire had been a necessary evil, a baptism by destruction, but it did not have to define me. I was more than just the violence I was capable of. I was still the man who could appreciate the beauty of a Rembrandt, the precision of a chemical formula, and the simple, profound peace of a rainy day. The rain gave me an idea. My water collection system, my little miracle of condensation, was slow and inefficient. But what if I could tap into the rain itself? The museum's roof had a drainage system. The blueprints on my terminal showed the network of pipes that carried the rainwater down through the building to the storm sewers. One of those main drainage pipes ran right through the service corridor adjacent to my vault. It was a thick, cast iron pipe, but it was a source of vast, fresh, clean water. If I could get to it, if I could tap into it, my water problem would be solved permanently. It would mean leaving the vault. A short, controlled excursion into the service corridor. It was a terrifying thought, but the promise of unlimited water, the most precious resource in this new world, was too great to ignore. The rain had not only lifted my spirits, it had given me a new mission, a mission of life, not death. I began to plan my first expedition beyond the steel door. It would be a small step, but it would be a step into a larger world, a world where it still rained. Day 23.
The plan was simple, and that's what made it so terrifying. I would open the vault door just enough to slip out, cross the 10 feet of hallway to the service corridor door, access the pipe, and return. It should take no more than 30 minutes. I spent the entire morning preparing. I packed a small bag with tools, a drill with a diamond-tipped bit for the pipe, a length of flexible tubing, and a collection of sealants. I strapped my flashlight sparker and 2 Molotovs to my belt. I donned my respirator, not for fumes, but to mask my scent. And I held the conservator, its steel tip gleaming in the emergency lights. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. This was a calculated risk, a necessary one. The most dangerous part was the door. The moment I began to open it, the sound would alert any blanks in the vicinity. I had to be fast. I took my position, my heart a frantic bird in my chest. I took a deep breath and began to turn the manual release wheel. The sound of the locking bolts retracting was deafening in the silence. It was a screech of metal on metal, a dinner bell for the dead. I cracked the door open just enough to see. The hallway was dark, charred and littered with the blackened bones of the blanks I had burned. The smell was horrific, but the hall was empty. I listened, straining my ears. Nothing but the distant, gentle drumming of the rain. I slipped through the gap, my spear held at the ready. My feet crunched on the ashen floor. I was outside. The air was thick with the smell of rot and rain. It was cold. I moved quickly, my back against the wall, my eyes scanning the darkness. 10 feet to the service door. It felt like a mile. The door was locked, a simple electronic keypad. No power. But there was a manual override. A keyhole. I didn't have the key. Panic flared. Then I remembered my training, my knowledge. I pulled out a thin, flexible palette knife and a tension wrench from my pocket. I had learned the basics of lockpicking from a security consultant who had been hired to test the museum's defenses. I had thought it was a fascinating, useless skill at the time. Now, it was the key to my survival. My hands trembled as I inserted the tools into the lock. The scraping sound of the metal was terrifyingly loud. I worked by feel, my mind focused, blocking out the fear. After what felt like an eternity, I felt the last pin click into place. The lock turned. The door swung open into pitch blackness. I ducked inside, closing the door behind me, and plunged the corridor into absolute darkness. I stood there for a full minute, not moving, just listening. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the gurgling of water. The drainage pipe. It was close. I cranked my flashlight. The beam revealed a narrow, dusty corridor filled with pipes and electrical conduits. And there it was, a thick, black pipe slick with condensation. I had found it. I worked with frantic efficiency, my fear giving way to focused determination. I drilled a small hole into the pipe. A jet of clean, cold rainwater sprayed out. I inserted the flexible tubing, sealed the connection with epoxy putty, and ran the other end of the tube back towards the door. I had done it. I had tapped the vein. I slipped back out into the main hallway, coiled the tubing, and retreated to the safety of my vault, sealing the heavy door behind me. The entire expedition had taken 27 minutes. I leaned against the closed door, my body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. I had done it. I had left my cage and returned. I had faced the dead world and won. And in my hand, I held the end of a thin plastic tube, from which dripped a steady, life-giving stream of fresh, clean rainwater. It was the sweetest victory I had ever known. Day 24. Water is life. I had never truly understood the meaning of that phrase until now. The thin tube running from the service corridor was a lifeline, an umbilical cord to the living world. It dripped steadily into a large solvent drum, and the sound was more beautiful than any symphony. I had an effectively unlimited supply of fresh water. This single resource changed everything. It was a profound psychological boost. The constant nagging worry about dehydration was gone. I could drink as much as I wanted. I took my first long, deep drink of the rainwater. It was cold, clean, and tasted of hope. But the water was more than just for drinking. It was a resource for hygiene, for sanitation, for a return to a semblance of civilization. I spent the day indulging in the ultimate post-apocalyptic luxury, a bath. I heated the water using a makeshift immersion heater I jury-rigged from the coffee maker's heating element and the terminal's power supply. It was a risky, dangerous contraption, but the reward was worth it. I washed off 24 days of grime, fear, and sweat. As the dirty water swirled down the drain, I felt as if I was washing away some of the darkness that had clung to my soul. I washed my clothes, scrubbing them with a harsh laboratory soap. I cleaned my living space, wiping down every surface, mopping the concrete floor. I was reclaiming my environment, imposing order and cleanliness on the chaos. The act of cleaning was purifying, both physically and mentally. It was a rejection of the filth and decay of the world outside. It was a statement that I would not become a savage, that I would hold on to the standards and rituals of my former life. With the water problem solved, my 30-day escape plan seemed much more viable. I could now afford to stay longer if needed, to wait for the perfect opportunity, the safest moment to make my move. The pressure was off. The new water supply also allowed me to think about another long-term problem, food.
I had my remaining protein bars, but they would not last forever. But the museum had a rooftop garden. I had seen it on the blueprints. It was a modern, green roof initiative. If the plants had survived, if they were irrigated by the rain, it could be a sustainable food source. The thought of fresh vegetables, of real living food, was intoxicating. My escape plan now had a new, more hopeful objective. I was no longer just escaping to survive. I was escaping to live, to build a new life in the ruins of the old. A life with water, with food, with a future. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat in my clean clothes, in my clean vault, and sipped the hot, fragrant liquid. It was a small, simple act of normalcy, but in this world, it was an act of profound and defiant hope. Day 25. My new routine, centered around the luxury of water and the hope of a future, was shattered in an instant. I was at the porthole, doing my routine observation of the hallway, when I saw it. A new blank. It was different from the others. The ones I had seen before were mindless, shambling things, driven by a basic, animalistic hunger. This one was watching. It stood at the far end of the hall, partially hidden in the shadows, its head cocked to one side, as if it were studying the vault door. It was taller than the others and leaner. It didn't moan or shuffle. It stood perfectly still, a silent, patient predator. I called it the observer in my log. Its presence filled me with a new and terrible kind of fear. The other blanks were a known quantity. They were dangerous, yes, but they were predictable. Their behavior was governed by simple stimuli: sound, hunger, fire. The observer was an unknown. Its stillness was more threatening than any amount of roaring or banging. It felt intelligent, calculating. I spent the entire day watching it. It rarely moved. It just stood there, a dark statue in the ruined hallway, its blank white eyes fixed on my location. It was a psychological battle, a contest of wills fought through a 4-inch thick piece of glass. Who were you, I thought, staring at its grotesque form? What do you want? It was as if it knew I was watching it. Sometimes it would tilt its head, a slow, deliberate movement that felt like a direct acknowledgement of my presence. It was unnerving. The other blanks seemed to give it a wide berth. They would shamble past, but none of them would get close to it. It was an alpha, a leader.
My previous victories, my fire, my chemical attacks, they suddenly felt hollow. I had been fighting the grunts, the foot soldiers. Now I was facing a general, and this general was smart. It wasn't interested in brute force. It was studying me, learning my defenses, looking for a weakness. My escape plan, which had seemed so solid, so hopeful, now felt like a child's fantasy. How could I escape when a sentient monster was standing guard right outside my door? The day passed in a tense, silent standoff. I did not train, I did not work. I just watched, and was watched. The vault no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage under the unwavering gaze of a zookeeper from hell. As night fell, the observer finally moved. It took a single, slow step forward, then another. It began to walk towards my door, its movements not the jerky shuffle of the others, but a smooth, silent, predatory glide. It did not stop until it was standing directly in front of the porthole, its face filling the small window. Its skin was pale and translucent, its skull-like features visible beneath. Its white, sightless eyes seemed to stare directly into my soul. Its mouth, a thin, lipless slit, slowly opened, and it spoke. Not in the guttural moans or raspy whispers of the others, but in a clear, calm, and perfectly human voice. "I know you can hear me, Mr. Vance," it said. "It's time we had a talk." Day 26. I stumbled back from the porthole, my mind refusing to process what I had just heard. A voice, a clear, intelligent voice. My name. It knew my name. "Don't be alarmed, Elias," the voice said, its tone calm and reasonable. It was a voice that belonged in a boardroom, not coming from the throat of a monster. "I'm not like the others. I'm what comes next." I forced myself back to the porthole. The observer was still there, its face pressed against the glass. What are you?" I stammered, my voice a dry whisper. "I am a consciousness, a hive mind. The mindless ones you see, they are the body, the vessel. I am the will that guides them," it explained. "We are the next stage of evolution, a collective organism, far more efficient than the fractured, individualistic species you represent." My scientific mind reeled. A hive mind? It was a concept from science fiction, not a biological reality. And yet, the creature speaking to me was proof. "How do you know my name?" I asked, my fear slowly being replaced by a terrifying curiosity. "This museum was a treasure trove of information," it said. "Employee records, your name, your profession, your psychological profile. You are a man of patience, of intellect, a worthy opponent. Unlike the screaming, panicked cattle that made up the rest of your species." It was flattering me, trying to build a rapport. It was a classic psychological tactic. "What do you want?" I demanded. "I want what you have," it replied. "This sanctuary, this fortress. It is a perfect place for a queen to birth a new colony. The art can be burned for warmth. The resources are useful." The casual way it spoke of destroying the priceless treasures in my care sent a chill down my spine. This creature was not just a predator, it was a nihilist. "And I want you, Elias," it continued. "Your mind, your knowledge. You could be a valuable asset to the collective. You could help us understand the artifacts of the old world. You would not be consumed. You would be integrated. You would live forever, a part of something much greater than yourself." It was offering me a deal, a devil's bargain. My life, my knowledge, in exchange for my soul, my individuality. "Never," I spat. The observer's lipless mouth seemed to curve into something resembling a smile. "A pity," it said. "Your resistance is admirable, but ultimately futile. My children have been working on your door for some time. They have found a weakness, not in the steel, but in the wall around it. The concrete is old, brittle in places. It will take time, but they will break through. I am offering you a more dignified alternative to being torn apart and eaten." It was bluffing. It had to be. But what if it wasn't? What if the scraping had not been on the door, but on the concrete frame? I had been so focused on the door itself, I hadn't considered the surrounding structure. "Think about my offer, Elias," the voice said, its tone turning cold. "You have 4 days. On the 30th day, we are coming in, one way or another." And with that, the observer stepped back from the porthole and melted back into the shadows of the hallway, leaving me alone with its horrifying ultimatum. My 30-day escape plan had just become a 4-day countdown to annihilation. Day 27. 4 days. 96 hours until the horde, led by a sentient monster, would breach my sanctuary. The devil's offer echoed in my mind. Integration. Becoming a part of its monstrous collective. The thought was more terrifying than death. My only option was to accelerate my escape plan. I couldn't wait until day 30. I had to leave, now, tonight. But first, I had to verify the observer's threat. Was it bluffing about the wall? I took a hammer and a chisel and went to the edge of the vault door's massive steel frame. I chipped away a small piece of the concrete. It crumbled easily. Too easily. The observer was right. The concrete was old, porous. Decades of micro-vibrations from the building's HVAC system had weakened it.
A sustained, coordinated assault with the right tools could absolutely break it down. A new sound started from outside.
Not scraping, but a rhythmic chipping sound. Tap, tap, tap. They were already at work. The sound was coming from the base of the wall, to the left of the door. They were exploiting the weakness. The countdown had begun. Panic, hot and suffocating, threatened to overwhelm me. I fought it back, channeling the fear into frantic energy. I had to prepare for my escape. Tonight was the night. I began to assemble my go bag, my movement swift and efficient. Water container filled to the brim. The last of my protein bars. My lock-picking tools. The flashlight sparker. 2 Molotovs, carefully wrapped in cloth to prevent them from breaking. I strapped my respirator to my belt. I checked the edge on my spear, the conservator. It was as sharp as I could make it. I was a soldier packing for a suicide mission. My route was planned, my gear was ready. But was I? I looked around the vault at the silent, shrouded paintings. My companions, my responsibility. I couldn't just leave them to be destroyed, to be burned for warmth by these things. It felt like a betrayal. I went to the portrait of Eleanor. I uncovered her face one last time. Her serene gaze seemed to calm my frantic heart. "I have to go," I whispered to her. "I'm sorry." I had a crazy, desperate idea. I couldn't save all the paintings, but I could save one, the Vermeer, the concert. It was painted on canvas, not wood. It could be removed from its stretcher bars. It could be rolled. It was a masterpiece, one of the most valuable paintings in the world. But more than that, it was a symbol of the beauty, the genius, the civilization that I was fighting to preserve. To save it would be to save a piece of humanity's soul. The decision was made. It was reckless. It was foolish. Carrying a priceless painting through a zombie-infested museum was insane. But it felt right. It gave my escape a purpose beyond my own survival. I was no longer just running for my life. I was on a rescue mission. I spent the next hour carefully, expertly removing the 350-year-old canvas from its frame. I rolled it carefully, with layers of acid-free paper to protect it. I slipped it into a sturdy, cardboard archival tube. It was about 3 feet long and heavy. It would be awkward to carry. It would slow me down. It might get me killed. But as I slung the tube over my shoulder, I felt a sense of rightness, of profound purpose. I was not just a survivor. I was a guardian, a curator of a dead world, and I would carry its last masterpiece into the uncertain future. Day 28. My original escape was planned for day 30. I was now 2 days ahead of schedule, forced into action by the observer's ultimatum. The rhythmic chipping on the concrete wall was a constant, maddening clock, counting down my final hours in the vault. I spent the day in a state of heightened readiness, a coiled spring of anxiety and determination. I went through my escape plan one last time, memorizing every turn, every doorway, every potential hiding spot on the museum blueprints. I did a final check of my gear. Everything was in its place. My spear felt balanced in my hand. The tube containing the Vermeer was secured tightly to my back. I ate what was left of my food, 2 protein bars and a handful of almonds. I needed all the energy I could get. I drank deeply from my water supply, hydrating my body for the ordeal to come. There was nothing left to do but wait. Wait for the deepest part of the night, the time when the Horde's activity was at its lowest. I sat in the darkness, my back to the wall, and I listened. The chipping was steady, relentless. They were making progress. I could hear small chunks of concrete falling to the floor outside. How much time did I have left? Hours? Minutes? I tried to meditate, to calm my racing heart, but it was impossible. The adrenaline was coursing through my veins. This was the eve of battle, the final, quiet moments before the storm. I thought about my life before this, the quiet,
academic world I had inhabited. A world of books, of art, of gentle, intellectual pursuits. It seemed like a dream, a life lived by another person. The man I was now was a stranger to that person. This man was a creature of the dark, a killer, a survivor. Had the apocalypse stripped away my humanity, or had it revealed a part of myself that had always been there, dormant, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge? I didn't know the answer, and I realized with a sudden clarity that it didn't matter. All that mattered was the next few hours. All that mattered was putting one foot in front of the other, of moving through the darkness, of fighting and killing and clawing my way to the roof, to the rain, to the sky. I looked at the shrouded paintings one last time, my silent friends. "Wish me luck," I whispered into the darkness. I stood up, my body humming with nervous energy. I took my position by the vault door. The time was near. I was as ready as I would ever be. The scholar was dead. The warrior was about to be born. Day 29. It was time. The chipping outside had paused, a brief lull in their relentless assault. This was my chance. I took one last, deep breath of the filtered, sterile air of my prison, and I began to turn the wheel. The screech of the bolts was a scream in the silence. I didn't hesitate. I pulled the heavy door open just enough to slip through and plunged into the darkness of the hallway. The stench of burnt flesh and decay was overwhelming. My eyes, accustomed to the dim light of the vault, struggled to adjust. The world was a landscape of shadows and vague, threatening shapes. I moved silently, my feet light on the ashen floor, my spear held low. The service corridor door was just ahead. My heart was a jackhammer in my chest. Every creak of the building, every distant moan, sounded like an imminent attack. I reached the door. My lock-picking tools felt clumsy in my trembling hands. The lock clicked open. I slipped inside the service corridor and closed the door behind me, sealing myself in pitch blackness. I was in. The first leg of the journey was complete. I leaned against the door, my body shaking, and forced myself to take slow, deep breaths. I could not afford to panic. I cranked my flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow, dusty cone through the darkness. The corridor was tight, filled with pipes and conduits. It was a claustrophobic's nightmare, and it was my path to freedom. I began to move, my spear scraping against the narrow walls. Ahead of me was the maintenance shaft. The blueprint showed a series of iron ladders leading up to the ground floor. It would be a hard, vertical climb. I reached the shaft. It was a square hole in the floor, with a ladder descending into darkness and another ascending into the unknown. I could hear a low, guttural moaning coming from below. The lower levels were infested. I had to go up. The climb was grueling. The archival tube on my back was heavy and awkward, banging against the rungs of the ladder. My muscles, already weakened by a month of malnutrition, burned with effort. I climbed in darkness, using the flashlight only in brief, intermittent bursts to check my path. After what felt like an eternity, my hand touched a solid ceiling. A trapdoor. I had reached the ground floor. I pushed it open, slowly, cautiously. It opened into a small janitor's closet. I was on the main level of the museum. I could hear them now. The shuffling, the moaning, they were close. This was the most dangerous part of my journey, crossing the main gallery. It was a huge, open space, no cover, a death trap. I peered through the crack in the closet door. The gallery was a scene from a nightmare. Dozens of blanks were shambling through the cavernous space, their white eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. They were moving aimlessly, like grotesque sleepwalkers. And in the center of the room, standing perfectly still, was the observer. It was as if it was waiting for me. It knew I was coming. There was no way to sneak past. I would have to fight, or create a diversion. I looked at the Molotov cocktail on my belt. I had one shot. I had to make it count. My plan had been to get to the roof,
But seeing the observer, seeing the sheer number of them, I knew that plan was suicide. I needed a new plan, a new destination. And then I saw it. On the far side of the gallery, an exit. The massive armored truck that was used to transport artwork. It was parked in the loading bay, its rear doors tantalizingly open. If I could get to that truck, it was a mobile fortress. It was a way out. Not just of the museum, but of the city. It was an insane, desperate gamble, but it was the only one I had. I took a deep breath, lit the wick of my Molotov, and kicked open the closet door. Day 30. "Hey!" I screamed, my voice raw and loud. Every head in the gallery snapped in my direction. The white, sightless eyes of dozens of blanks, and the cold, intelligent gaze of the observer, all fixed on me. For a terrifying second, there was silence. Then a collective hungry roar erupted from the horde, and they began to move towards me. A wave of gray, rotting flesh and snapping teeth. I didn't wait. I hurled the Molotov cocktail, not at them, but at the far corner of the gallery, at a display of ancient flammable tapestries. The beaker smashed, and the wall erupted in a sheet of flame. The diversion. The blanks, drawn by the sound and the light and the heat, hesitated. Their simple minds were confused by the new, more exciting stimulus. Some of them turned towards the fire, moaning and shuffling towards the flames. It was the opening I needed. I didn't run towards the truck. I ran along the wall, using the shadows, my spear held tightly in my hand. My target was the observer. I knew, with a primal certainty, that I could not escape as long as it was alive. It was the brain of the horde. Kill the brain, and the body would fall into chaos. It saw me coming. It let out a high-pitched shriek, a command, and several nearby blanks broke off from the main group and charged at me. The first one reached me, its jaw unhinged, its claws outstretched. I didn't think, I reacted. My training took over. I sidestepped its clumsy lunge and thrust the conservator forward. The steel tip punched through its chest with a wet, sickening crunch. It collapsed in a heap. Another one came at me from the side. I swung the heavy oak shaft of the spear like a baseball bat, connecting with its head. The sound of its skull cracking was like a gunshot in the cavernous room. But my eyes were locked on the observer. It was not charging. It was gliding towards me, its movements unnaturally fast and smooth. It held a piece of sharpened metal in its hand, a makeshift dagger. We met in the center of the gallery, the fire raging behind us, casting our shadows long and distorted on the marble floor. It was a battle between two worlds, the old world of intellect and art, and the new world of brutal, collective consciousness. It was fast, incredibly fast. It lunged, its dagger a silver blur. I parried with the shaft of my spear. The metal scraped against the ancient oak. We circled each other, a deadly dance in the heart of the dying museum. It was stronger than me, faster than me. But I had one advantage. It could not see. It was tracking me by sound, by the scent of my living flesh. I had to be smarter. I kicked over a metal stanchion. It crashed to the floor. The observer's head snapped towards the sound, and in that split second of distraction, I lunged. I put all my weight, all my rage, all my desperation into a single powerful thrust. The conservator, my beautiful, ugly weapon, born of art and desperation, slammed into the observer's chest. It went deep. The creature let out a shocked, gurgling sound. Its white eyes seemed to widen. It looked down at the spear protruding from its body, then back up at me. "Impossible," it whispered, its perfect, human voice now a wet rattle. A single man." I twisted the spear. "This is for Eleanor," I snarled, and pushed it deeper. The observer collapsed, its body dissolving into a cloud of gray dust, leaving nothing but its tattered clothes and the sharpened piece of metal. The moment it died, the rest of the blanks in the gallery stopped.
They froze in place, their heads lolling, their limbs going slack. They shuffled aimlessly, their guiding intelligence gone. They were just empty, mindless puppets now. I didn't wait to celebrate. I ran. I ran past the confused, shambling blanks, past the burning tapestries, towards the loading bay. The armored truck was there, its doors open, a metal ramp leading into its dark interior. I scrambled up the ramp and into the back of the truck, pulling the heavy tube containing the Vermeer in after me. I slammed the heavy rolling door shut, plunging myself into darkness. I had made it. I was safe. For now. I fumbled my way through the truck's cargo hold to the cab. The keys were in the ignition. A miracle. With trembling hands, I turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life. I slammed the truck into gear, and, with a lurch, I crashed through the loading bay doors, out into the rain, out into the dead city, out into my new life. I drove through the ruined streets, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I had survived. I had escaped. I had a fortress on wheels, a priceless masterpiece, and a future that was a complete and terrifying unknown. I had been trapped for 30 days, but as I looked out at the dawn breaking over the ruins of my city, I realized that my story, my real zombie survival story, had only just begun.